Hello, James here with another interesting topic, and hope you're doing good out there this evening on this cold winter. Well, soon to be cold, it'll be soon going to warm up. This topic is going to start out a little bit different, and I'm going to kind of walk you through the horrible atrocities of America on race.
But now we want to turn our attention to another, what really is a major issue, but is not being covered like a major issue in the U.S. South, specifically in Mississippi, more specifically in the Jackson, Mississippi area, Hinds County there. 215 bodies were found in unmarked graves there in Jackson, Mississippi. There's a lot to it. I wish it was being more reported, but nonetheless, we're very, very honored to be joined by the Reverend Kiana Jones, who's a community organizer in Atlanta, Georgia, to talk more about this. Reverend Jones, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always great to be with you on the freedom side.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And I get my first question for you in a way is, I hate to even say this, but I mean, were you surprised? I think everyone was shocked by the story, but were you surprised to see a story like this? 215 bodies, mainly poor people, buried in secret graves, essentially, in a state like Mississippi?
Honestly, no. I was not surprised to hear a story like this. We know our history here in the South. We know our history in the United States, and we know that unmarked graves are not uncommon anywhere in the United States because every state has a so-called pauper's grave. But what is surprising is that in Jackson, Mississippi, many of these people were not without family, were not without next of kin or a way to contact them. So these families were robbed of the right to put their loved ones away, to rest in their final peace properly and with dignity. And when you think about that, I think that really speaks to the larger overarching issue of dignity and who is seen as a person worthy of being recognized by humanity. We know that the majority of people buried in these paupers' graves from state to state are black people. This sends us the message that black people are not worthy of humanity, that we don't deserve dignity, that even in death, they want to rob us of every small bit of humanity that we have. And then you think about the people in those graves, like Dexter Wade, who were buried with identification. Dexter Wade had a state ID that listed his home address. Dexter Wade's mother had reported him missing since March. It wasn't revealed until later, many months later, that Dexter Wade was actually hit and run over by an off-duty police officer. This is egregious. This is not something that should be allowed to continue. And it really pains me that the leadership in Jackson, the leadership wants to gloss over this and talk about a failure in communication. And now, we're going to make sure that there's an alert system where people can be notified if their loved ones, happen to be at the coroner's office and nobody's there. Well, where was your alert system already? Is that not already part of your policy that you will seek the next of kin, that you will try to notify someone that their loved one is there in the coroner's office, that they are seeking to make final arrangements for these people? But what I find is a lot of song and dance, a lot of posturing, and a lot of glossing over the fact that there were over 200 unmarked graves. And look at where they are. At the prison. And these graves are so shallow that buzzards were flying around. You don't even give people enough respect to bury them in any type of coffin. You're not embalming the bodies, you're just throwing body bags in the ground and covering them with dirt. What does that say about how you truly feel about the people who you're just throwing into these graves?
I just wanted to note when you mentioned Dexter Wade, his mother told NBC News that she had hesitated. It took a lot for her to even call the police initially to report him missing because her older brother was killed by police a few years earlier. And you mentioned, I mean, he was also killed by police and he had identification on him. And when I first saw this story, I saw, over 200 bodies found in unmarked graves. This must be like from 100 or 200 years ago or something. Like nobody knew there was this mass grave or something. And then I was just, I mean, even, that's horrifying enough, of course, but then to see that these are people who are just being killed in different ways, different Black people being killed in different ways, and just the police department, local authorities just don't care about notifying their families. And then they're having inmates. That's the other aspect of this story. I mean, you mentioned it a bit about this being behind a jail, but can you talk a bit about the people who were digging these graves and actually doing these burials?
Absolutely. Initially, when I heard the story, I myself almost dismissed it because I immediately assumed, these are inmates being buried here who they can't reach the next of kin. That was my assumption. I actually thought that in 2023, that would be the case. But when you think about a person that's already been sentenced to a life where they are not treated as human, where they have no dignity, to take that same person and put them into a position where they will have to dig a grave that might end up being their own fate. The trauma that people must be experiencing, the thoughts that must go through the minds of the inmates who are forced to do this labor. But could you imagine that some of those inmates might be coming across the bodies of people they know? What happens when you see your neighbor and you're digging a shallow grave and just throwing their body in there? What happens when it's someone you grew up with or a family friend? What happens? And then what happens to the quality of life of that inmate that's already caged, that's already being treated like less than human? What hope do they have? Because now they have images that they will never get out of their minds. An image that I'm sure they fear might someday be them.
I mean, it's horrifying to think about on just basically every single level, quite frankly. And I thought the point that you made about the leadership there, just sort of glossing it over, I felt, similar with the water crisis, all these different pieces. I mean, it really talks about, I think, another major issue here in the South that sort of, quite frankly, regardless of race, how poorly served the communities, especially working class Black communities, are by the political class. I mean, you're based in Atlanta. We've seen the Cop City debacle being pushed by these people. Obviously, we're mentioning Mississippi. We could go on and on to every state, but that really just feels like an important factor coming up here on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, this upcoming Monday, the national holiday, is how just, I don't even really know what to call them, but just how disappointing, so much of the, political class in many of these places that's supposed to be part of this, new democratic dispensation that we got after the civil rights movement, how disappointing a lot of that has turned out to be.
Absolutely disappointing. I commonly call them the Black misleadership class. What they are proving to us is you cannot stack the deck black and think that institutions that were created on racism and that are sustained and driven by racialized capitalism are going to change simply because Black faces are running the system. Just because you put Black faces into the mix does not mean that that system is going to completely change from what it was designed to be. What we see, again, a mayor, Chokwe Lumumba, Black mayor, legacy, name recognition. People thought that this was the great Black hope. Here we are in Jackson, majority Black city council. I mean, we got the dream, right? We're going to be okay because we have Black people looking after other Black people. But we have to remember here in the South particularly, the legacy of whipping boys. How there were Black people who oversaw other enslaved black people. There were black people who contributed to making sure that other enslaved black people were caught by slave catchers. There were black people. There has always been a black misleadership class to throw us right out into the open where we can be ravaged by a system that was never meant to care for us, to promote us, to nurture us, or to give us any dignity. And it's really, really disappointing and extremely disheartening that particularly here in the South, this continues to perpetuate itself because we keep electing people just because they look like us. And I'm so tired of having to tell people that representation is not enough. And do you even represent me if you don't embody the same values, if you don't have the same political ideology, if you don't believe that every person is worthy of dignity and respect, if you believe that somehow a person's financial class should determine how well they are treated in this life, then you can't possibly represent me. And if you continue to make agreements with the white supremacist establishment just for a seat at their table and a place in this horrendous system, then you definitely can't represent me.
You know, I wanted to ask about if you could talk a bit about this other case out of Mississippi where there was an 11-year-old child shot and killed. Well, wait, was he killed?
Just shot.
Okay, I'm sorry. Wow. Well, he was shot in his home by a police officer who was responding to a call. And that police officer who shot a child in his home, I just want to emphasize that. Shot a child in his home, reinstated, right? Reinstated after being suspended. Can you talk a bit about that case as well?
Here we are once again in Indianola. We have a full black board of aldermen and mayor who reinstate a police officer who arrives at the home of young Adarian Murray when Adarian himself called the police. And forgive me if I get a little emotional on this one, y'all, because it hits close to home. Because my mother was a victim of domestic violence. And I remember calling the police more times than I can remember. And the times that they showed up, the way we were met by them, how we were treated, how my mother was criminalized even though she was the victim, and how, because of the treatment of these same officers, she was dehumanized even in death. So you have young Adarian Murray who calls the police because his mother's ex-boyfriend, who is known to be violent, shows up at the house, calls the police for help. I would venture to say that many young children these days still believe that 911 is the number that you call for help. They still believe that police are supposed to serve and protect. But when this officer showed up at the home of Adarian and his mother, the way he showed up was wrong from the beginning. The tone with which he spoke to them, he's just yelling, "Where is he? Come out. Everybody come out." I mean, Adarian, 11 years old, comes out with his hands up. Comes out with his hands up to show, hey, I'm innocent. I'm not doing anything. I'm complying. I'm listening because I trust you, officer. But that officer immediately shoots this 11-year-old boy, collapsing his lung, fracturing his ribs, lacerated liver, 11 years old. 11 years old. And all he could remember was blacking out and singing at some point. But at 11 years old, he now has stated in interviews that when he's alone and he's thinking, sometimes he just sees himself lying in a coffin. He sees himself dead. And what is that for an 11-year-old to look forward to or to have to be afraid of? But for the municipal government of Indianola to reinstate that officer, you reinstate an officer who shot and has wounded an 11-year-old boy who has permanently traumatized Adarian and his family. And I would venture to say 14-year-old boys who look just like a Darian. But these are the type of people that you would have on your police force. And what we see is that whether it's in Indianola, whether it's in Atlanta, whether it's in Minneapolis, the life of a black child doesn't seem to matter much. And it really hurts, because what this shows is that black children are never seen as innocent, no matter what.
Do you know the US Solar Company's nasty little secret? It turns out if you live in Ohio, they have to give you solar panels.
Scientific theories can have an influence on society, be it what is healthy to eat, whether some surgeries help or hinder, or even whether if the earth is flat. The theory does not need to be proven right, as even an idea on shaky ground can influence others' actions. One such theory would probably have one of the largest effects on the 20th century, as it would be used as a disgusting excuse for some of the world's worst atrocities. Following the scientific theory would lead to genocide, segregation, and social racial laws that, by modern standards, leave a disgusting taste in the mouth, a convenient excuse to allow unacceptable actions by individuals and governments alike, and even in contemporary times, the subject filters its way into modern-day society. It has mostly been used as an open door for misuse, scientific racism, and tyranny. Today we're looking at one of the most dangerous scientific ideas, especially when used to prove prejudice and be used as an excuse for callousness. The theory is of eugenics, and its long-reaching effects in the 19th and 20th century. As such, I'm going to rate this subject here 9 on my ethical scale. Welcome to the dark side of science. Our story starts with a very famous book by a much revered scientist, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. The work was released in 1859 and is widely regarded as the foundation of evolutionary biology. The new field of research would, over the next few decades, split into many different disciplines as evolution became more widely accepted. Many scientists looked to develop Darwin's ideas. One such person was one of his own cousins, Francis Galton. Galton was fascinated by his cousin's work and sought out to research variation in human development. He started to look at different aspects of human variation, covering anything from mental ability to height, and from facial images to fingerprint patterns. Galton combined Darwin's theory of evolution with the concept of heredity to develop his new idea. The concept of genes came from Gregor Mendel's, when in 1865 the basic laws of heredity were discovered. His experiments with peas showed that each physical trait was the result of a combination of 2 units and could be passed from one generation to another. Galton, upon discovering the obvious variations across human population, wanted to see if defects or attributes are hereditary, passed from parent to child. For this work, a monumental amount of data was needed to be able to correlate any characteristic within individuals. This would lead to his 1869 book, Hereditary Genius, an inquiry into its laws and consequences. During the research for the book, Galton looked into who he described as successful men in a given profession. He surmised that their sons were more likely to achieve such eminence themselves than if they were not closely related to eminent individuals. Basically saying that successful people have successful children. From this, Galton theorised that it was evidence for genetic transmission of human intelligence. During his research for the book, he showed that the numbers of eminent relatives dropped off when going from first degree to the second degree relatives, and from second degree to the third. The book gained praise from his peers, including his cousin Darwin. But the work had limited appeal outside of the scientific community. He thought that the most desirable traits in humans were transmitted through heredity, and thus thought that selective breeding could achieve improvement of the race, where high-achieving children be nurtured and given a good education, and once old enough, encouraged to marry with another high-achieving partner. He also stated where the better sort of immigrants and refugees from other lands were invited and welcomed, and their descendants naturalised. As for the lower achieving people, he stated that less desirable people could find a welcome and refuge in celibate monasteries or sisterhoods. This would become a theme for later eugenicists. Next, Galton looked into finding out if his theory of nature over nurture was true, and to do so, he envisioned studying twins that had been separated at birth. As if raised in different families with different social and economic backgrounds, would this affect the intelligence of each sibling? He used questionnaires to collect data and published it in an 1875 paper, The History of Twins, in which he used to test his nature over nurture hypothesis. His next book would coin the actual term eugenics. Although this was his first use of the word, as seen in Hereditary Genius, Galton had already been developing its main tenets, but had yet to name it. His book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and its Development, would first use the term eugenics, which opened up saying, "This book's intention is to touch on various topics, more or less connected with that of a cultivation of race, or as we might call it, eugenic questions, and to present the results of several of my own separate investigations." He devised a plan that would give marks for a person's preferable family traits, and as such, that society should reward early marriage between families of high rank via provision of monetary incentives. In his book, he pointed out the tendency of British high society of late marriages between eminent people, which resulted in less of an average physical size of their children. Galton did not suggest any particular selection method, but instead hoped that society would naturally favour breeding desirable couples with the help of financial incentives. He would flesh out his term definition in his 1908 book, Memories of My Life, stating that the official definition of eugenics as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. The field still focused on selective breeding, much like with animals, through the means of financial encouragement. These ideas did not particularly take off in Galton's native UK, but they did in other parts of the world, most notably in the United States in the early stages of the 20th century. But before we look across the pond, let's summarise Galton's idea. It is split into two parts, positive and negative eugenics. The former being the promotion of good traits through encouragement of high-achieving individuals having children, and the latter being discouraging people with undesirable traits such as mental illnesses or any other handicap from having children. This second form of the theory would be the claimed justification for multiple human rights issues and ultimately genocide. Now let's look at the propagation of the field in the early 20th century.
When I found out I had metastatic prostate cancer,
That was really give you insight on some interesting topic, and where this come from, and this come from this.
They're able to, throw some money around a little more to get things done and hide things. But the story of what happened to brother Bruce Tucker,
This come from this.
it's all facts. The story about what happened to Sister Henrietta Lacks is all facts. Anybody they want to, they can look it up. And a lot of these stories, they do not go mainstream unless somebody wants them to. You know what I mean? Somebody who has some control or influence in the media, unless they want them to. And it just goes, stories like this just goes to show how unsuccessful the white community in America has always been. They're not successful at anything. These doctors are supposed to be talented and smart and gifted people. People look at them as great surgeons for being the first to do something in America, but actually, they really do suck. They're crooks. They're losers and white supremacists who can't get anything done in a just manner with having respect for humanity. Therefore, you are not successful. I don't care what anybody says. If you have to do things like this and disrespect people's humanity to get something done, you are not successful. I don't care who you are. People applaud them. They speak highly of them. Not me. I don't respect any of them. Nor do I believe in that anybody in American history ever did. I don't believe anybody in the white community in American history ever did anything great. Not one person. I do not believe that. I'm still waiting to hear about one that did something great. You know, some real live stuff, like the stuff that we did, you know, with nothing. I want to hear about, I mean, I don't even want to hear, I don't even care. I do not believe that any of them, these forefathers, these old white doctors, these old white inventors and scientists and whoever you want to think about, Babe Ruth, none of them are great to me, okay? I don't believe any of them ever did anything great, okay? There's actually a book about this if you want to get it. It's called Organ Thieves by a man by the name of Chip Jones. You can check it out. Anyway, people, easy.
Yeah, it was about these guys that stole some organs off. Oh shit! About some organs that they stole. But showing that. Now I'm going to show you something that's really going. Hopefully that this go through. I don't get copyright strike for this, but it's going to consist with the KKK. But it's not what you're going to think it is. These KKK members had something last word before they was sentenced to death.
Frazier John Miller Jr.
And for your conviction for capital murder, you will be transported to the Kansas Department of Corrections to carry out the sentence of death by injection.
At the Johnson County Courthouse, a man had just been sentenced to die by lethal injection. Now you may be wondering, what crime could he have possibly committed to get such a sentence? Frazier Glenn Miller Jr., commonly known as Glenn Miller or Frazier Glenn Cross, wasn't any regular inmate. He was a known American domestic terrorist, but most importantly, he was the leader of the defunct White Patriot Party, which was formerly known as the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Simply put, Frazier Glenn Miller Jr. was a well-known KKK member. However, being a KKK member wasn't the reason why Miller got the death sentence.
Possible hate crime, and it comes one day before Passover. A gunman goes on a rampage in Kansas City. Police say the shooter asked people if they were Jewish, and if they responded yes, he opened fire. 2 people were killed outside a Jewish community center, and a 3rd person died at a Shalom retirement community.
On April 13th, 2014, Miller opened fire at the Overland Park Jewish Community Center shopping in Overland Park, Kansas, and outside a retirement home. 3 people were shot dead, and several others were shot at, although they escaped uninjured. This wasn't the handiwork of a rampage shooter. Instead, these shootings were carried out by a man who was an advocate of white nationalism, white separatism, anti-Semitism, and Odinism. Born on November 23, 1940 in North Carolina, Miller was introduced to white racialist politics after reading a copy of The Thunderbolt handed to him by his father, a newsletter published by Edward Reed Fields of the National States Rights Party. At the time, he had served 2 tours of duty in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. However, he was discharged from the U.S. Army later in 1979 after he was found distributing racist propaganda. In 1980, he founded the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, which eventually developed into the White Patriot Party, also known as WPP. The ideology of the party was avowedly pro-apartheid, and its members strictly believed in the racist Christian identity theology.
One God, one race, one nation, so help us God Almighty. White power!
They also openly advocated for the establishment of an all-white nation in the American South Territory. Clearly, these radical views didn't endear the WPP to the majority of the people, and it didn't help that the Southern Poverty Law Center, aka SPLC, had accessed the party's computer systems and discovered that they were planning the assassination of the SPLC leader Morris Dees. This evidence was presented in court, and the White Patriot Party were barred from engaging in any form of paramilitary activity. Miller had to sign an agreement with the SPLC leader Morris Dees for him to drop the lawsuit the SPLC had brought against his party. However, in 1986, he was accused of violating the terms of the agreement by operating a paramilitary training camp. He was found guilty of a criminal contempt of court charge and was sentenced to a year in prison. In 1987, a letter that appeared to have been typewritten and signed by Miller made its way to 5,000 recipients. It began with the words, "In the name of our Aryan God through his beloved Son, I, Glenn Miller, now this 6th day of April 1987, do hereby declare total war. I ask for no quarter. I will give none. I declare war against niggers, Jews, queers, assorted mongrels, white race traitors, and despicable informants." The letter further proclaimed, "Let the blood of our enemies flood the streets, rivers, and fields of the nation in holy vengeance and justice. The Jews are our main and most formidable enemies, brothers and sisters. They are truly the children of Satan, as Christ tells us in St. John 8:44. We promise death to those who attack us or attempt to place us in Zog's dungeons." Despite his racist beliefs and many criminal charges, Miller openly contested for political positions, although he never won. To many, this might have seemed like the ramblings of a fanatic, considering that he hadn't harmed anyone yet. Sadly, Miller would prove just how seriously he took his beliefs by carrying out a crime of hate. Miller's wife Marge claimed that her husband had gone to a casino in Missouri a day before the shooting. On the morning of April 13th, 2014, he had called her at around 10:30 a.m. saying his winnings were up and all was well. Less than 3 hours after the phone call, 3 people were shot dead that day in Kansas City. The victims of the Jewish Community Center shopping were identified as William Lewis Corporon and his 14-year-old grandson, Reed Griffin Underwood, and both were United Methodist Christians. The third victim was 53-year-old Terry Lamano, who had been killed at the parking lot of Village Shalom. She was a Christian who attended St. Peter's Catholic Church in Kansas City, Missouri. She had been visiting her mother, who was at the retirement home. Miller had also shot at other people, including one person who was Jewish. Fortunately, they were able to escape uninjured. Miller was found outside a nearby elementary school and was immediately taken in as a suspect.
He surrendered at a nearby grade school, screaming the Nazi salute.
What do you know about the Bermuda Triangle? Have you ever been there for work purposes or training purposes?
As a suspect.
He surrendered at a nearby grade school, screaming the Nazi salute.
The white supremacist trial was a national sensation, especially after he decided to take up his own defense, where he showed an utter lack of remorse for what he had done.
You made it impossible for me to explain what was on my mind and my specific intent. Therefore, by extension, you prevent me from getting a fair trial and you guarantee a guilty verdict.
This outburst was caused by Judge Thomas Kelly Ryan, disallowing him from introducing 3 exhibits, which included a video of him leading the White Patriot Party and 2 news articles in court. Miller also stated that he had an emphysema attack 10 days before the killings and decided he was going to take out Jewish people before he died. He claimed that at first, he didn't know if he had the courage to carry out the shootings, but afterward felt an exhilaration that dwarfed even the feeling of jumping out of airplanes when he was in the Army. He also said to the judge and prosecutor, "If I had known you and you were there, I would have probably shot you too." On August 31st, 2015, Miller was found guilty of a single count of capital murder and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder and assault and weapon charges. On November 10th, 2015, Miller was sentenced to death by lethal injection and was immediately placed on death row. Now to the big question, what happened to this KKK member on death row? Fraser Glenn Miller Jr. died in the El Dorado Correctional Facility on May 3rd, 2021 at the age of 80. The cause of death was deemed due to natural causes. Thomas Blanton Jr. and Bobby Frank Cherry.
Today marks 60 years since a bomb planted by the Ku Klux Klan exploded inside a Birmingham church, killing 4 little girls, and it's one of the darkest days in civil rights history.
Indeed, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing was one of the darkest days in history. The bombing, which occurred on September 15th, 1963, was so vicious that it claimed the lives of 4 little African-American girls named Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Dennis McNair. Aside from the murders of the 4 girls, the explosion also injured between 14 and 22 people and was described by Martin Luther King Jr. as one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. This terrorist attack that left a blight on the timelines of American history was committed by 4 well-known KKK members and white supremacists named Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., Bobby Frank Cherry, Herman Frank Cash, and Robert Edward Chambliss. Unfortunately, no arrests were carried out against the men until 1977, when Robert Chambliss was charged and convicted of the first-degree murder of one of the victims, Carol Denise McNair, who was just 11 years old when she was killed in the explosion. However, 2 of the main perpetrators, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. Jr. and Bobby Frank Cherry would be allowed to walk free until the early 2000s when justice was finally served and both men were placed behind bars. Blanton, born on June 20th, 1938 in Washington, D.C., was a notorious racist who was well known in the Birmingham, Alabama area. He, alongside Cherry, who was born on the same day but 8 years earlier, were members of a local Ku Klux Klan chapter. According to the testimony and evidence presented by a third man, known as Mitchell Burns, an FBI informant who acted as an associate of both men, Blanton was close friends with Cherry. According to Burns, he would sometimes go out with both men carrying a very large reel-to-reel tape recorder in the car trunk to record the group's conversations. These recordings would eventually be used as key evidence in the prosecution of both men. According to the recordings, both men clearly showed their racist sentiments and had even raised the subject of the church bombing in one of their conversations. The recording showed that the men approved of the tragedy, and Blanton had even wanted to start bragging by saying something that sounded like he and Cherry had been involved in the bombing. However, Cherry, who wasn't so close with Burns, quickly cut him off saying, "Now this good old boy doesn't need to know about that," and laughed. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, although tragic, wasn't such a huge surprise considering that, in years leading to the event, Birmingham was nationally known as one of the most violent and racially segregated cities in the country. Black residents were only allowed access to public amenities that were different from those accessed by white residents in the area. Things were so bad that blacks in the area couldn't find corporate jobs and were only allowed menial employment, with many being cooks and cleaners. There were no black police officers or firefighters in the city, and there were several cases of bombings reported in black homes and institutions that catered to African Americans, with at least 21 separate explosions recorded in 8 years before the church bombing. Martin Luther King Jr. had once referred to the city as probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States, and it was even nicknamed Bombingham. All of these attacks against African Americans in the city led to a campaign carried out by civil rights activists, and when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Congress on Racial Equality started a campaign to register African Americans to be able to vote in Birmingham, there was increased tension in the city. The three-story 16th Street Baptist Church was a rallying and meeting point for these civil rights leaders and was therefore an easy target. On the morning of September 15th, 1963, as Sunday service was underway at the church, at approximately 10:22 a.m., a 14-year-old girl named Carolyn Mall, who was the acting Sunday school secretary, received a call from an anonymous caller who simply said, "3 minutes." Less than a minute after the caller terminated the call, the church building shook heavily. A bomb which consisted of a minimum of 15 sticks of dynamite had exploded, which blew a 7-foot hole in the church's rear wall and a crater that measured 5 feet wide and 2 deep in the ladies' basement lounge, destroying the rear steps, and it even blew a passing motorist out of his car. All but one of the church stained glass windows, which depicted Christ leading a group of young children, were destroyed in the explosion. 5 young girls had been in the basement changing into their choir robes when the explosion occurred. By the time a search was carried out following the bombing, 4 of the girls were found dead. One of them had a piece of mortar embedded in her skull, while another was badly decapacitated, that her body was only identified by a ring and her clothing. According to Reverend John Cross, pastor of the church, the bodies of the girls were found stacked on top of each other, clung together. The 5th girl and only survivor, 12-year-old Sarah Collins, sister to Addie Mae Collins, was so badly wounded that she had 21 pieces of glass embedded in her face, including her eyes. Investigators were soon able to get a list of KKK suspects, which included Blanton, Cherry, Cash, and Chambliss. However, no prosecutions were carried out until 1977, when Chambliss was the first to be convicted in the case. At this time, the FBI was able to retrieve the recordings in 1997 made by Mitchell Burns, which had been misplaced, and the rediscovery of these tapes led to the arrest and prosecutions of Blanton and Cherry. Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. was arrested and brought to trial on April 24, 2001, and he pleaded not guilty to the charges of murder against him. He also chose not to testify on his behalf at the trial. He was found guilty of his role in the bombing and was sentenced to 4 life sentences. He was to be incarcerated at Holman Correctional Facility at Maury, Alabama. Bobby Frank Cherry, on the other hand, was also arrested and tried on May 6, 2002. Just like his counterpart Blanton, Cherry pleaded not guilty to the charges and refused to testify in his defense. However, the evidence against him was damning, especially as his former wife also testified as a witness against him. On May 22, 2002, the jury, after almost 7 hours of deliberation, found Cherry guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Bobby Frank Cherry, who throughout the trial showed no lack of remorse, had some words for the courtroom.
Most people have no clue that in 2023 the best way to make money on Amazon is not with...
Had some some words for the courtroom as his sentence was read. He stated, "This whole bunch lied through this thing. The trial. I told the truth. I don't know why I'm going to jail for nothing. I haven't done anything. What happened to both KKK members in prison? Just 2 years after he was sentenced, Cherry died of cancer on November 18th, 2004. He was 74 years old at the time of his death. Blanton, on the other hand, died on June 26, 2020 at William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility from unspecified causes just 6 days after his 82nd birthday. His death occurred a year before he was to appear before the parole board to appeal his parole. Dylan Roof.
Yeah, I went to that church in Charleston, and, I did it.
Those were the confessions of a 21-year-old American white supremacist who perpetrated a mass shooting at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, also known as Mother Emanuel, in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. The young man had opened fire on church members during a routine Bible study, killing 9 people.
Good morning, America. Breaking news, deadly church shooting. Tragedy in Charleston. At least 9 people killed overnight in a massacre in a historic black church.
I do believe this was a hate crime.
Police say this suspect, a white man in his 20s, walked into the Bible study, sat down with the group, and opened fire.
At about 9:15 p.m. on June 17, 2015, the Charleston Police Department received a chilling call from a woman who claimed that a shooting had occurred at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, a historically black church and the oldest African Methodist Episcopal church in the South. On that day,
911, what's the address of the emergency?
Emmanuel Church is plenty people shot down here. Please send somebody right away. Shot the pastor, he shot all the men in the church. Please come right away.
21-year-old Dylan Roof, wearing a gray sweatshirt and jeans, made his way to the Emmanuel AME Church. According to the accounts of survivors, he had specifically asked for the senior pastor of the church, Reverend Clementa C. Pinckney, and sat next to him, listening to the Bible study going on. As soon as the group closed their eyes for prayers, he stood up, pulled out a Glock 41.45 caliber handgun, and pointed it at the group. When one of the church members, 26-year-old Tywanza Sanders, asked why he was trying to attack them, Dylan said to him, "I have to do it. You are women and you're taking over our country, and you have to go." He then opened fire on the group saying, "Y'all want something to pray about? I'll give you something to pray about." According to one of the survivors named Polly Shepard, Dylan had asked her, "Did I shoot you?" She replied, "No." Then he said, "Good, because we need someone to survive because I'm going to shoot myself, and you'll be the only survivor." He allegedly then turned the gun to his head and pulled the trigger, but there was no blast, as he had run out of ammunition. That was when he fled the scene. By this time, 8 people had died on the scene, and the 9th person died at MUSC Medical Center. All the victims were African Americans. The young mass shooter was a white supremacist who was enraged about the killing of Trayvon Martin and the 2015 Baltimore protests sparked by the death of Freddie Gray. Roof believed that the blacks were taking over the world and expressed his desire for racial segregation in the United States and to start a race war. He also owned a website named LastRhodesian.com where he expressed his racist opinions in a 2,444 unsigned manifesto, all broken down into the following sections: blacks, Jews, Hispanics, East Asians, patriotism, and an explanation. One of these opinions read like this: "I have no choice. I am not in the position to alone go into the ghetto and fight. I chose Charleston because it is the most historic city in my state, and at one time had the highest ratio of blacks to whites in the country. We have no skinheads, no real KKK, no one doing anything but talking on the internet. Well, someone has to have the bravery to take it to the real world, and I guess that has to be me." The website also had a collection of photos that further amplified Roof's racist beliefs. Before the shooting at Emmanuel Church, the senior pastor, Reverend Clementa C. Pinckney, one of the 9 victims, had held rallies in nearby North Charleston after the shooting of Walter Scott by a white police officer, which somehow made it seem like his death had been an assassination. According to one of Roof's friends, "I don't think the church was his primary target because he told us he was going for the school, but I think he couldn't get into the school because of the security, so I think he just settled for the church." At about 10:44 a.m. the next day, Roof was arrested in a traffic stop in Shelby, North Carolina. The police had received a tip-off from Debbie Dills, a driver who had recognized Roof driving a black Hyundai Elantra with a 3-flag Confederate States of America bumper decor and South Carolina license plates. He was immediately taken in for interrogation, and there, Roof proved he wasn't sorry for what he had done.
The fact of the matter is, what I did is so minuscule to what they're doing to white people every day all the time. And just because that doesn't get on the news doesn't mean it's not happening.
5 days after the shooting, a grand jury indicted Roof on 33 federal charges, with 18 of these charges carrying the federal death penalty. On July 31st, 2015, Roof pleaded not guilty to the federal charges at the behest of his lawyer David Bruck. On December 15th, 2016, the jury found Roof guilty on all 33 counts, and on January 11th, 2017, he was formally sentenced to death.
After roughly 3 hours of deliberations, a jury of 3 black members and 9 white members agreed unanimously that Dylan Roof deserves to die for the murders of 9 black parishioners at the Mother Emanuel Church in June of 2015.
After his sentencing, Dylan Roof was transferred to death row at Terre Haute Federal Prison in Indiana. He now joins the long list of male inmates awaiting execution by lethal injection. However, it isn't likely that he will be executed soon. Richard Tipton, James Rohn Jr., and Corey Johnson, all drug gang members who murdered 9 people to protect their crack trade, have been on death row since 1993. Fortunately, whether Roof is executed or not, there is the guarantee that he will spend the rest of his life locked away for the murders of the 9 innocent churchgoers. Daniel Lewis Lee.
For the first time in 17 years, a federal prison inmate was executed this morning. Daniel Lewis Lee received a lethal injection in Indiana after the U.S. Supreme Court allowed the execution to proceed. He was convicted of murdering 3 members of an Arkansas family back in 1996, including an 8-year-old girl.
Daniel Lewis Lee, also known as Daniel Lewis Graham, D.L. Graham, and Danny Lee was a self-confessed white supremacist, neo-Nazi, and a convicted felon who lived a violent life. Born on January 31st, 1973, in Yukon, Oklahoma, Lee was raised in a home where he was frequently neglected and abused. At the young age of 17, he received a 5-year suspended sentence after he attacked a man named Joseph Joey Wavra III on July 24th, 1990. He struck the man until he collapsed, and with the assistance of his cousin, John David Patton, moved Wavra into a sewer tunnel. The duo then stole items from Wavra and disposed of his clothes after Lee handed Patton a knife that was used to kill him. Both Lee and his cousin were arrested, but Lee pleaded guilty to robbery as the murder charge was dismissed. His cousin, however, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he remained there till he died in 2014. Despite this experience, Lee showed no signs of outgrowing his behavior, and this eventually led him to fellow white supremacist Chevy Kehoe in 1995. Kehoe recruited Lee into his white supremacist organization known as the Aryan People's Republic, or the Aryan People's Resistance, aka APR. 2 years later, the two would carry one of the most brutal murders in Arkansas history. They would rob and murder 3 family members, which included a husband, his wife, and their 8-year-old daughter. The reason? Both men stole guns, ammunition, and $50,000 in cash from the Mullers as part of their plans to establish a whites-only nation. In January 1996, Lee and Kehoe left Washington and traveled to Arkansas. On January 11, 1996, the duo arrived at the home of William Frederick Muller, a gun dealer who lived near Tilly, Arkansas. As a gun dealer, it was normal for William to have a large collection of ammunition, weapons, and lots of cash. He was an easy target as Kehoe and his father had robbed him in February 1995, so they expected to find more loot at his home. Lee and Kehoe decided to dress as FBI agents, but when they entered the home of the Muellers, they discovered no one was home. They decided to wait, and once the family returned, Lee and Kehoe immediately overpowered and incapacitated William and his wife, Nancy Ann Mueller. The duo then decided to torture the couple's 8-year-old daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Powell, shocking her with an electric cattle prod in a bid to make her tell them where they could find their loot. This brutal method seemed successful as they found $50,000 cash, along with guns and ammunition. Once their mission was accomplished, Lee and Kehoe shot each of the 3 victims with a stun gun, which caused them to pass out. Unfortunately, they didn't stop there, as they then placed plastic bags over the heads of their unconscious victims and sealed the bags with duct tape, which caused them to suffocate to death. Again, the duo proved how cruel they were by taking the victims in Kehoe's car to the Illinois Bayou, where they taped rocks to the bodies of the Mullers and threw them into the swamp. It wasn't until late June 1996 that the bodies were discovered in Lake Dardanelle near Russellville, Arkansas. On June 17, 1997, Lee and Kehoe were arrested in Cedar City, Utah, and the Muller family murders were treated as a federal crime since it was done to support a racketeering enterprise. Prosecutors sought death sentences for both men, but Kehoe was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment. Seeing this, prosecutors planned to pursue a similar sentence for Lee, but they were directed by the United States Department of Justice to argue for a death sentence. On May 4th, 1999, Lee was sentenced to death for 3 counts of murder in aid of racketeering, after prosecutors pointed out that his previous convictions made him a future threat to society. Earlene Branch Peterson, the mother of Nancy Muller, was one of the people who was strongly against Lee's death sentence, and she pleaded for clemency on his behalf. She said, "Yes, Daniel Lee damaged my life, but I can't believe taking his life is going to change any of that. I can't see how executing Daniel Lee will honor my daughter in any way. In fact, it's kind of like it dirties her name, because she wouldn't want it and I don't want it," she continued. Still, the death sentence was upheld, and the execution was scheduled for July 13th, 2020. Lee was then transferred to Terre Haute Federal Prison in Indiana, where inmates on death row were held to be executed. He would remain there for 21 years waiting till he was eventually executed by lethal injection. Considering that the execution date collided with the COVID-19 pandemic, family members of the Mullers asked for a rescheduling of the date since they couldn't travel to witness the execution. However, the 7th Circuit ruled that although allowing the victims' families to such events is standard, there is no legal basis for their attendance and refused to change the date. This led to the family members sending an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court. The execution, which was scheduled to be held at 4 p.m. local time, was halted along with other federal executions when U.S. District Judge Tanya S. Chutkan implemented a 5-4 decision. However, on the morning of July 14th, 2020, the Supreme Court lifted the halt that Judge Chutkan had implemented, allowing the Department of Justice to proceed with the execution. Later in the morning, Lee was brought to the execution room, and when he was asked to make a final statement, he maintained that he was innocent of the crime. "I didn't do it. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I'm not a murderer. You're killing an innocent man." He was pronounced dead at 8:07 a.m. after he received a single-dose lethal injection of pentobarbital. Henry Francis Hayes.
The murder of Michael Donald changed history. He was killed by members of the Ku Klux Klan and hanged in the last lynching in the United States.
19-year-old Michael Donald was walking home with a pack of cigarettes he had gotten for his sister from the nearest gas station when 2 young men driving in a car pulled over. They lured him over to their vehicle by pretending to ask for directions to a local club. When he got closer, he was forced into the car at gunpoint, and the men took him to a secluded area in the woods near Mobile Bay. Donald tried to escape and ran into the woods, but the men caught up with him and attacked him, beating him with a tree limb. One of them then tied a rope on his throat while the other continued to beat him till he stopped moving. To be sure he was dead, they slit his throat 3 times and then hanged his lifeless body from a tree on Herndon Avenue. Mobile and Donald's body remained there until the next morning.
It broke my mother's heart to know that he was killed because he was a black man.
This brutal murder was the handiwork of 2 Ku Klux Klan members, 26-year-old Henry Francis Hayes, along with his co-conspirator, 17-year-old James Llewellyn Tiger Knowles. Prior to the murder, members of Unit 900 of the United Klans of America, also known as UKA, were enraged following the trial of Josephus Anderson, an African-American charged with the murder of a white police officer in Birmingham, Alabama, during an armed robbery. While the jury deliberated the case, which was brought to Mobile due to a venue change, KKK members complained that Anderson wasn't being convicted because the jury had African-American members. The first trial ended with a deadlock of the mixed jury, and when the case was retried, it resulted in a mistrial that was declared on Friday, March 20th, 1981. If a black man can get away with killing a white man, we ought to be able to get away with killing a white man. These were the words of Benny Jack Hayes, who was considered the second highest ranking member of the UKA. Members of the Klan then had a meeting that same day, after which Henry Hayes, son of Benny Hayes and James Knowles, set out looking for a black person to attack. Michael Donald, who had no prior criminal record or any link to Anderson's case, was targeted simply because of the color of his skin. The FBI was called in to investigate the case, and at first they believed that it was a drug case where a deal had gone wrong. However, Donald's mother, Bola Mae Donald, insisted that her son didn't do drugs. It wasn't until June 1983, 2.5 years after the murder, that Hayes and Knowles were arrested after Knowles confessed to FBI agent James Bodman. Immediately a trial commenced for Hayes, who pleaded not guilty to capital murder. Knowles, who had already pleaded guilty to the charge against him and was sentenced to life imprisonment, testified against him. On December 19, 1983, the jury found Hayes guilty of the charge against him and and recommended life in prison without parole. However, the judge overruled their verdict in February 1984 and instead gave Hayes the death penalty. He was incarcerated in Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama on death row. However, it would take another 12 and a half years before he was eventually executed in Alabama's electric chair known as Yellow Mama on June 6, 1997. Henry Francis Hayes, who was 42 at the time of his murder, was pronounced dead at 12:18 a.m., with Michael Donald's brother being a witness at the execution. Hayes' execution was Alabama's first execution since 1913 for a white-on-black crime. He is also the only known KKK member to have been executed for the murder of an African American in the 20th century. Also, Donald's mother filed a civil suit of over $10 million, later reduced to $7 million against the United Klans of America. However, the sum was so huge that the UKA, known as one of the largest and most violent KKK factions, went bankrupt. John William King.
John William King, the ringleader of the dragging death of James Byrd Jr., was executed this evening in Huntsville. King died by lethal injection for the brutal murder that took place more than 20 years ago.
John William King, the mastermind behind one of the gruesome hate crimes of the late 20th century, had finally paid the price for his crime. An avowed racist and white supremacist, 23-year-old King, alongside his longtime friend, 23-year-old Sean Berry, and another associate, 31-year-old Lawrence Brewer, also white supremacists, had murdered James Byrd Jr. The trio dragged him for 3 miles behind their Ford pickup truck across an asphalt road. The sad part was that Byrd was alive throughout much of the ordeal and was only killed after his body hit a culvert, which severed his right arm and head. On June 7, 1998, the 49-year-old Byrd accepted a ride from Sean Berry, John William King, and Lawrence Brewer, as he was acquainted with Berry. Unfortunately, it would turn out to be a deadly mistake, as the 3 men took him out of town and beat him up badly with a bat. They also spray-painted his face and, in a debasing act, urinated and defecated on him. Like that wasn't bad enough, they chained Byrd by his ankles to their pickup truck and dragged him for 3 miles along Huff Creek Road. By the time they were done, he was dead and badly mutilated, as his right arm and head had been severed when his body hit a culvert. King, Berry, and Brewer then dumped Byrd's mutilated remains in front of an African-American cemetery and drove off. A motorist discovered the decapitated remains the next day, and the police were immediately alerted. Investigation went underway, and the police found 81 places that included parts of Byrd's remains. Items belonging to Brewer and King were also found along the crime scene, and since they were well-known white supremacists, the murder was treated as a hate crime. All 3 men were arrested and prosecuted. King, throughout the trial, didn't show remorse and did little to hide his racist beliefs. He had several racist tattoos splattered across his body, some of which depicted a black man hanging from a tree, the words Aryan Pride, the patch of a white supremacist gang known as the Confederate Knights of America, as well as Nazi symbols. He also mentioned,
"We want to be there for those we love, even after we're gone. AARP level benefit term life."
He also mentioned how he had been repeatedly gang-raped by black inmates while he was imprisoned at a Texas prison before the murder. In a letter intercepted by jail officials, he had written to Brewer saying, "Regardless of the outcome of this, we have made history. Death before dishonor. Sieg Heil." Despite all of these, King claimed he was innocent, saying that Berry had dropped him and Brewer off at their shared apartment before committing the murder. The jury didn't buy his argument, and in February 1999, he was sentenced to death for his role in the kidnap and murder of James Byrd Jr. The execution date was scheduled for April 24, 2019, and King was held at the Allen B. Polunsky unit before he was moved to the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. King would spend 20 years on death row before his execution drew close. 2 days before the execution was to take place, King tried to appeal to both the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and the Texas Board of Pardons and Parole, but both appeals were denied, and his execution was to go on.
One of the most painful chapters in East Texas history is moving towards closure now, more than 20 years later. John William King is set to be executed tonight in Huntsville, convicted of a gruesome murder that many have called a modern-day lynching.
On April 24, 2019, 44-year-old King was taken from his holding cell and placed on a gurney in the death chamber. He was hooked to an IV and had no personal witnesses around. When asked if he had a final statement, he had nothing to say but provided a written statement.
When asked if he had a final statement, Mr. King simply responded with the word no. He did, however, provide a written statement that reads as follows: capital punishment. Them without the capital get the punishment.
King was injected with a lethal dose of pentobarbital at 6:56 p.m., and 12 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. Brewer had also been sentenced to death by lethal injection and was executed at the same unit on September 21st, 2011. Right up to the moment of his death, he showed no remorse and had even said a day before his execution, "As far as any regrets, no, I have no regrets. No, I'd do it all over again, to tell you the truth." Sean Barry was the only one who seemed to show a hint of remorse for his actions. He was handed a life sentence and is currently incarcerated at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Ramsey Unit, where he awaits parole in June 2038 when he is 63 years old. These men committed some of the most despicable and brutal crimes against African Americans, and their stories will remain etched on the sands of times. If you've been wondering what happens to KKK members on death, I hope you found this video particularly informative. Click on the card showing on your screens for more.
Well, ain't that something? So, yeah, you know, justice came, but it finally came. And this should be a message to the other ones who want to try to do the same thing to innocent people. But yeah, that man deserved it. And you know, and then the thing about it is that they weren't even remorseful for it. They ain't said they were sorry. And you know, black people, we're so quick to forgive and everything, but what if the people you forgive, they don't want to be, they're not even willing to forgive what they've done, the evil that they've done. There's no remorse, ain't no sorry, nothing, just straight up evil. And yeah, that's how. And so, why that showed the eugenics film, that sparks the mentality of these groups, so they learn stuff like that. I just showed you a little snippet of it, but that's how it starts right there, and it gives you warped opinions about different individuals. So that was me showing that video about that earlier. But you see, even to today, with the first video, you see how some things ain't changed. That's why the evilness in this land is just unbelievable. The evilness that people have in this land, and how many people out there is more bloodshed underground on America, based on just one of the incidents of racial. How many innocent victims are out there that we don't even know about? Family members that disappeared, like James Byrd, and later found out discarded. But this is how ugly racism is. And now this just confirms some things I've been saying, that it's not going to go away. You see how from different centuries after centuries, it's not going to go away. It's taught in the home. And some people are willing to take it to a whole hatred, to a whole different level. With the people that done nothing to them, groups of people that done nothing to them, but who always strikes out and get this vengeful to strike out? It's them. It's these individuals that was raised up in our environment. Just like the young man that was he lived about 20, 30 miles away from Buffalo, New York. The one went there and shot those people. There's no black people in Clunkland where he lived at. What was the purpose of that? He never ran across any black people, but he just felt like he had an urge to go and shoot some black people in the market in Buffalo. Buffalo already going through some stuff like that with segregation and stuff like that. Then they ignite things because there was other incidents up in Buffalo, New York. But you see what I'm saying? It's like they agitate, and then when they get caught, it's like, hey, this you want to do? You want to take someone's life just based on the color of their skin? For people that did nothing, they think about it, they did nothing to them. And it's like, you know, that's some serious hatred for you to look at another individual and just have it in your mind that that's some deep, evil, rooted stuff that to them, like, you just gotta go basically take them out just because they color their skin. You feel like, and it built a so-called white Aryan nation based on violence. You see how? But don't worry, because that's the history of America. And politicians and judges and them always cover them up. And this is what is produced. So some things don't ever get old. And this is what we try to tell people. This stuff don't get old. It passes on from generation after generation, which I've mentioned in other videos. And if someone don't get to talk with these people and watch you interact and who you socialize with, that's what they do. But it's a lot of insecurity, envious, and jealousy towards black people who already have some have more different disadvantage. Why are you picking at people that already have a disadvantage in ways that you have that have nothing to do with your situation? That's what I wonder. But anyway, I hope you find this very enlightening and showing. Hope you enjoyed. Subscribe and like. Until next time, you guys take care and be blessed and educate your children on what's in the world, because ugliness is still abroad. But keep your prayers up and be blessed. Take care.